Hello, government students. This is the video lecture for Learning Module 2, in which I will go over the first part or the first half of Lesson 2. And Lesson 2 is devoted to the founding of American national government. This is a list of the objectives, the things I hope you'll be able to do after you complete the learning module itself, the entire learning module 2. So just make that distinction. You see that it says lesson 2. This is an online class, so we are working with Learning Module 2 this week and for this lecture. I want to start out by giving you just a very quick overview of the state of the Western world during the colonial times, and that because that's what we're going to really be spending our time on is the colonial era during this learning module. So here is a map of North America and part of Central America during around 1750. And I wanted you to notice the different colors on the map and understand just the sheer number of European nations that were colonizing the Americas. You see in the kind of bluish purple color up here, kind of in the middle of the North American continent, this is France. So that France had a heavy investment in North America for trade. The British are red. And again, they're concentrated along the eastern coast, which makes sense because they're sailing across the ocean from England and they land here in the eastern coast. So that's where the British had colonized. And then the yellow is Spanish. The Spanish actually preceded the French and the English and landed here in the West Indies first, and then came into Mexico, what is now Mexico, and moved up through the western part of the North America. What the map doesn't depict is that Russia had also colonized. You see this area here along the western border. Russia, it's actually a little bit in an argument with England over territory here in the Pacific Northwest. We don't hear a lot about that, but it was happening. So you see a lot of different European nations, along with England, the British Kingdom, were seeking to colonize North America and Central America as well. And a few other countries that aren't even on here, the Dutch, Netherlands, Portuguese, the Danes, Danish people, the Swedish people were also heavily involved in colonization in the New World. So ask yourself then why? Why were all these countries interested in North America and Central America? Why are they coming here? And it is essentially a business venture. They came here for the natural resources. When the Spanish arrived, they discovered a huge cache of silver and other natural resources, very valuable resources that they were bringing back to Spain. And England noticed that, and France noticed that. And so they wanted in on the action. So it prompted them to likewise come across and see what kind of riches they could discover and claim on new territory in this foreign land. So this colonization effort was not just the British, it was not just the French, it was many European nations, and they're all in it as a business investment, looking for raw materials and natural resources they could claim for themselves to enrich their kingdom. And this process of colonization is prompted by an economic policy called mercantilism. You're going to hear a lot about mercantilism in this learning module because it played such a huge role in the development of our nation. To give you the definition, mercantilism is an economic system applied by all European countries, not just Great Britain, but all of them. And it is founded on a belief that your goal as a kingdom is to enrich your kingdom, to make it more wealthy and more self-sufficient. And you do that by having land, because land produces natural resources that you can then export or sell to other kingdoms, to other nations. And when you sell them, you are paid. So it's a sales transaction. You make money for your kingdom when you can export your goods. So the more land you have means the more resources you have, means the more exports that you can sell, and the more money you can make. So mercantilism is tied into this effort of colonization. By claiming this land in the Americas and colonizing these areas, they have access to new resources they can then export to other nations. So the goal of mercantilism: increase your exports and decrease your imports. So the more you have, the less you need to buy or import from other nations. That makes you more self-sufficient and independent. So that's the goal of mercantilism: increase exports, decrease imports, enrich your kingdom by exploration and settlement and colonization of new territory you expect to be ripe with various gold and silver and other resources, spices, things that have a lot of value in the international market. The colonies that Great Britain was able to establish, this all occurred late 1500s, early 1600s. So that's why you see some of these dates. That's when Great Britain was active in settling North America. And by about 1750, there were 13 colonies in North America, 13 British colonies. And they're all concentrated here, as I said, along the eastern coast. And there we are. South Carolina was one of the original 13 colonies. So now we'll look a little bit more closely at some of the aspects of colonial life in the British colonies during this time period of 1620 to 1760-ish. So the settlement process all the way leading up to kind of a turning point in the perspective of the colonists. So I want to set in your mind, first of all, the characteristics of the typical colonist. In order to be willing to sail across an ocean, this is like a 3-month trip, people. This wasn't something quick. It was dangerous and took a long time. A lot of people got sick and died on the trip. So this is a huge risk to sail across the ocean and settle in uncharted territory. I'm sure the people in Great Britain, the settlers, had heard stories of great wealth coming from the New World, but also great danger, conflict with native people. And so there's a lot of risk of death, of illness, of failure. And you had to accept that if you were going to be willing to come to the New World as a settler. So that really took a special kind of person who'd be brave enough to do that, someone who's very confident in their ability to survive and to provide for themselves and not require any help from any other person. And so that means they would share an independent spirit and value self-sufficiency. Many of the settlers were not very wealthy people. They were marginalized peoples. So at an individual level, there are a variety of reasons why people were coming to North America, to the colonies. I'm sure you've heard of the religious motivations. Many people were coming to escape religious oppression, but also many were coming just so they could have their own land, that they could, have the promise of wealth and prosperity in this new world. They valued owning land, and land was in short supply in England. So coming across to this new world promised them all these opportunities that they would not otherwise have in England. It gave them this distance from England. So it's a geographic separation, as I've kind of demonstrated. They're sailing across an ocean, but it's a cultural separation as well. If they came to this new world, some of the classism and elitism of living in England would go away. They would have greater opportunity to own their own land, whereas in England, they would likely have been tenants, dependent upon another person for their provision. And so this promised independence and self-sufficiency, wealth, land ownership, and a means of escape from some of the cultural stratification and religious oppression that existed in England. And land was abundant. As far as they knew, it was infinite. Mapping of North America was certainly not complete. And so as far as they knew, they could settle miles and miles and miles west. It would just seem like it went on forever. They quickly set up local governments. Once people settled, many of them received charters from the king that allowed them to institute a local government, like an assembly. You may have heard something called the House of Burgesses in Virginia. So the Virginia colony had its own government, and they were elected leaders. They collected local taxes. They regulated local trade. It was like a little mini nation there in this little colony. They were definitely British subjects. They were answering to King George in Parliament, but they were so far separated from the mother country, it seemed as if they had their own little world there, and they could establish their own government, their own way of life. In Learning Module 1, we talked a lot about the political philosophies underlying our national government. And this is the time period in which those philosophies made their way to America. It was during this age of reason, something you may have heard would be the Enlightenment era. The Enlightenment is sort of a philosophical shift in understanding that began in Europe and spread all over the world. And it spread as well to the North American colonies. And it allowed people to recognize their own ability to reason, think for themselves, and feel empowered and less dependent upon hierarchy, political hierarchy and authority, religious hierarchy and authority, to think for themselves and make their own choices. So those principles we talked about: liberalism, that the paramount concern of any good government is to protect the natural rights of individuals; republicanism, a concern of good government is the common good. So government leaders should set aside their personal interest and pass laws that favor the common good of all. Popular sovereignty, that people are naturally vested with the power to govern themselves, to control their own destiny, and to govern and to elect their own government. They can give their consent, popular consent. The people can consent to be governed, to abide by the laws of their government, but it's an exchange. Here is social contract theory. It is an exchange. In turn, government has to provide laws that protect the natural rights of the people and support the common good. The Great Awakening is something we haven't talked about just yet, but it had a tremendous impact on the colonists. It is the Great Awakening was a spiritual and religious revival. Excuse me, I have a bit of a cold. I apologize if I cough in this lecture. So the Great Awakening is this even very evangelical, charismatic, kind of emotional, religious revival period. Preachers who had broken away from the institutional churches in Europe, the Catholic Church, and then in England, the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. They were dissenting religions. They disagreed with the institutionalized churches, believing them to be corrupt and impure. And they sailed across to the colonies and started preaching, like tent revivals, as you might have seen on TV before and other movies and whatnot. They held these revivals and they were teaching people that they didn't have to abide by the strict rules of their church, of the institutional churches in their, even the local ones, even the Congregational Church in some of the colonies. These preachers were telling them they could determine their own fate. They could have their own personal relationship with God. They could interpret scriptures on their own. They didn't need to step back and let their priest tell them what to believe or how to pray. And so this kind of added fuel to the fire in the sense of questioning authority and recognizing your own autonomy, your own power. And so unintentionally, the teachings of the Great Awakening just affirmed the Enlightenment philosophies of natural rights and liberalism and popular sovereignty. And that's all that was a lot of what was going on in colonial life. But I want to circle back to mercantilism and talk to you for just a second how it was being applied in the colonies. If you look at the map here, you're going to see something that may look familiar. This is a reflection of triangular trade. So the trade, the trade that occurred with the colonies was very, very controlled. You see the arrows, the red arrows. These are the natural resources that were discovered in the American colonies, in the North American colonies, and down in the West Indies. And they were going straight back up to Great Britain or to Great Britain's plantations in Africa. So they're staying within the kingdom. They're not being shipped off to Europe. The colonists were prohibited by a navigation act. They began in 1651. They were prohibited from selling their natural resources to any European country. They could only send them to Great Britain. So whatever resources that settlers and farmers in the colonies were able to grow or discover, they could only sell them back to merchants in Great Britain or, like I said, in their plantations in Africa. And they also could only buy manufactured goods from their mother country, from Great Britain. They couldn't buy things from Europe. So England put taxes on imports to sort of favor and incentivize trade just between Great Britain and the colonies. The awful middle passage you see is this bottom blue line where enslaved peoples were being shipped over to work on the plantations in the colonies. Now, this is the system. These were the rules. But for them to really have full effect, they have to be enforced. And so if England was serious about enforcing these laws restricting trade, they would have battleships here along the coast, patrolling the ports in their colonies and ensuring that there was no smuggling or illegal trading with European nations. But England was so caught up in other wars with these other foreign nations, they weren't able to patrol the ports and to really enforce the navigation laws. Instead, they were practicing something called salutary neglect, which is fancy for saying turned a blind eye. They just knew smuggling was happening. They knew the colonists were trading with European merchants, but they couldn't do anything about it and weren't enforcing it very strictly, at least at this time. Now that changes. This image here at the bottom is just meant to emphasize the relationship between the colonies and their mother country. It was the duty of the colonists to provide these raw materials only back to the crown, to the kingdom. So I said it all changed. Now I'm going to tell you what that change was. It was the French and Indian Wars, what really kickstarted it. England was often, for centuries, fighting with France. France was enemy number one to Great Britain. And as I showed you previously, France had a large holding in North America. And boundary lines were not well established. And so there was a lot of disputed territory, which you can see in yellow here. And the dispute kind of comes to a head in 1763, excuse me, 54, and the war began essentially, and it happened mostly on um, on American soil here, and there were sea battles as well, but you can see all the battle sites, and they were occurring here in the colonies. So the colonists were the boots on the ground. The British regulars were shipped over to fight, but many of the soldiers fighting the French and Indian War were American colonists. They were the militiamen from the various colonies who were fighting on behalf of Great Britain, fighting against the French over trade and territory in this disputed area. And it lasted quite a long time. This is a bloody war. There's a lot of loss, a lot of death, very tragic. But it does finally come to an end. England wins. And so normally the winning kingdom gets the land. And so it did. It got all of this disputed territory here. And so you think colonists would be quite pleased with that because it meant they had all this land now that they could settle. But unfortunately for them, the King of England issued a proclamation right at the end of the war called the Proclamation of 1763. And it limited their ability to go past a particular boundary line. It's called the Proclamation Line. You see it in red here on this slide. They could not settle west of the Proclamation Line. So this territory that is England territory right here in gold or yellow was reserved. Native Americans were left to live there and trade there. The French weren't immediately kicked out of the area. So whatever territorial benefit that the colonists might have enjoyed was taken from them, or at least delayed, postponed. They weren't immediately able to move west and claim what they had fought and died for. So that's the problem. The settlers, really the British colonists, were very resentful of this. And so let me go now and talk about some of the changes that occurred after. So this is post French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War. You hear it referred to both ways. I mentioned already restrictions on settlement in the Western territories. They weren't supposed to settle west of the Proclamation Line, but they did. Anyway, many moved west in spite of the proclamation. So conflicts with Native Americans along this disputed territory continued. There's a very famous battle that occurred between Native Americans and British colonists called Pontiac's War of 1763. So right at the same time, England has won this war against France. Its colonists become embroiled in a very vicious and violent battle with a sort of a coalition of Native American tribes led by a chief called Pontiac. I think I'm saying that correctly. I apologize if I have not. But it's a terrible, long, and bloody battle. And so Great Britain the king feels that he should keep these British regulars, the soldiers who had come as well to fight the French and Indian War, remain. They stayed there because they were needed to sort of be a police force to help protect the settlers along the disputed territory. Following the French and Indian War, England starts cracking down on the smuggling that I mentioned previously. They began enforcing the navigation laws that had been in place all along. They had just been sort of neglecting, turning a blind eye to the smuggling. Well, they stopped doing that. Their warships are there in the ports, having just fought this battle with France. They are now prepared to enforce the navigation laws, and they do. And a particular resented navigation law was that smugglers who were caught in the act would be taken back to London for their trial. And that was a huge offense because they would not have a jury of their peers. They wouldn't be judged by their fellow colonists. They'd be judged by strangers living back in London. So that was a particular problem. that the colonists had with the Navigation Acts. There were also new taxes that England began imposing on internal goods. So this is not taxation on trade, like the imports and exports that were part of the Navigation Acts. These are taxes on everyday items, things that British colonists use often internally. So things that they grow, things that they use and trade, among enter the between the colonies, tea, sugar, paper, those sorts of things. England imposed taxes on those goods. Also a problem for the colonists. And also, again, the British regulars are there on site in the colonies now, and they are witnessing some of the resentment and efforts to push back against the new taxation laws and trade laws. And so the word gets back to the British government, and they start increasing their control over colonial governments. King George would remove a colonial governor and replace him with the king's nephew, like a crony of the king would be installed as the new royal governor of a colony, to try to take back some of the control over the governance of the colonies. And that was, heavily resented. The colonists were accustomed to self-government, and now they were losing it. So this also becomes a problem. So those are, the main changes in the economic and political life in the colonies that were a consequence of the French and Indian War. The colonist point of view is common sense, but I've got it listed up here just to focus our study. As far as they were concerned, having been the boots on the ground, been the soldiers in the French and Indian War, they wound up not benefiting from their labors, from their sacrifice, because they couldn't move west. They weren't able to actually settle the land they had won. So that is their point of view, is that they had not reaped the benefits of the war. And they resented the control that Great Britain was now imposing over their economy, especially the internal taxes. And they resented Great Britain's increasing control over their local governments. And what was the battle cry of the revolution? No taxation without representation. Well, that makes its appearance here because the taxes had been passed by Parliament without any direct representation from the colonies. The British government was a parliamentary monarchy. So they had a king, but they also had a lawmaking body called Parliament. And within Parliament, there are two chambers, a House of Lords and a House of Commons. And the House of Commons are made up of elected representatives. They are supposed to be average people who come and are involved in policy making in the British government. But they don't have representative districts like we do, like we have now. They were believed to represent all British citizens, and that would have included British colonists in North America. Well, the colonists did not feel like those representatives in Parliament were actually speaking their concerns, voicing their concerns, their opposition to these taxes. So they didn't feel like they had a voice in their own government that was imposing these new laws, these new tax laws in particular. So they are very resentful of their inability to elect their own representatives and send them back to London to speak for them in the British government. As far as the British government is concerned, this proclamation line that restricted settlement was there to protect white North Americans, white settlers, from the violent conflict with Native Americans. So, as far as the British government is concerned, this proclamation line is necessary to help keep peace and order in these disputed territories. They had incurred a great deal of debt in fighting a war. Wars are very expensive. They had to get loans from other countries to help pay for that war. Now they're having to pay back those loans. So England is heavily in debt at this time. And they are imposing these new internal taxes. They're raising external taxes in order to pay off the war debt. And since the war, as far as the British were concerned, favored the colonists, they thought it reasonable and appropriate for the colonists to help pay off the debt through these new taxes. The British government believed that their efforts to patrol the ports and cut down on smuggling was really just an enforcement of laws that had already existed, the navigation laws. And they believed the colonists should be satisfied with this, what they would term virtual representation in Parliament, that it was enough. The House of Commons was speaking for the colonists as they were speaking for all British citizens. So I guess you could say the British government told the colonists kind of, hush, you've got enough. This is enough. Don't complain. That was essentially their point of view. You are probably aware of some of these. These are some of the best known pieces of legislation that the British government imposed on the colonists. And you're not responsible for knowing the details of all of these. I'm just putting them up there to kind of help you gain perspective of the sheer number of them when they were imposed. And you can read through your textbook and see what they involve. There's one in particular I want to point out, and it was the Stamp Act. This was a tax on paper. If you went to buy a sheet of paper from your local store, you had to pay a tax, and in order to prove you had paid the tax, the merchant would stamp it. So that's why it's called the Stamp Act. There'd be a little stamp on the paper proving you paid your tax. Well, that's an internal good, and it's a new tax, and the colonists are upset about it. And so they coordinate themselves and form a Congress. This is called the Stamp Act Congress. And it's not all the colonies. It was just a few of the colonies sent delegates to this Congress. And they got together and they wrote something called the Stamp Act Resolves. And the resolves were just their kind of statement that they were offended by this tax, felt that it was unfair and unjust, and petitioned their government to repeal it. So here's your good example of civic engagement by British citizens coming together, assembling together, petitioning their government for a change in tax policy. And they're successful. King George repeals the Stamp Act. So it worked. And that gives them a sense of accomplishment and hope. But unfortunately, almost immediately after repealing the Stamp Act, Great Britain imposes other acts. So, the Quartering Act, the Tea Act, other new laws followed. So even though this was successful, it wasn't a complete success. The concerns and resentment of the colonists continued. And so some of the coordinated efforts that the colonists engaged in were a formation of like the Stamp Act Congress, but it was to a large extent initiated by this organization, the Sons of Liberty. That's the men's version, and then there were Daughters of Liberty, the women's version. And they coordinated boycotts on British-made goods. And that was a good way to avoid paying taxes. If you don't buy from Great Britain, you're not having to pay those taxes. To buy local goods, homespun goods. And these organizations published their political beliefs in leaflets that were shared abroad through the mails, through the postal system in the colonies. So here's the power of the pen, successfully kind of uniting and coordinating an effort to boycott and reject the new change in policies imposed by the British government. It did get bloody in some of these instances. You see a few pictures of the more violent aspects of the rebellion by the colonists. The Boston Massacre, I'm sure you're familiar with. The burning of the Gaspee is this ship here. No loss of life, but a huge loss of property because that was a British ship that had run aground off the coast of Rhode Island. It contained a lot of British goods, which were destroyed when colonists sailed out a little bit. It had gotten kind of beached just offshore. And so they, as soon as the people who were on the ship got off and came to land, some colonists sailed out and set it on fire, kind of similar to the Boston Tea Party, where they destroyed all the tea. Committees of correspondence is another one you should pay attention to. That's just an effort to coordinate exchange of information among the colonies, and they became a more formal organization around 1772 and spread from Massachusetts out throughout all the 13 colonies. Committees of correspondence, so groups of people who help kind of spread the word. Here's what the British government is doing. Here's why we don't like it. Here's the boycotts and the ways how we're gonna respond to it. Please join us. That sort of effort. And again, you knew about the Boston Tea Party there. Despite all of their boycotting, as we know, the new taxation and control by the British government on the colonies continued. So the colonists stepped up their game and they formed something called the Continental Congress. The delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies convened in Philadelphia in September of 1774. Georgia was the only one who did not send any delegation to be a part of the Continental Congress. Their task was to prepare kind of a united front. Here are the things that you're doing wrong, Parliament, King George, shame on you. This is unjust, unfair, and here's what you ought to do about it. They wrote, it's called the Declaration of Rights and Resolves. They're not declaring their independence. Please don't confuse this with the Declaration of Independence. It's a separate prior one. And they're just laying out their case for what their government ought to be doing. And they kind of expected it not to work. And so they agree with one another. If the king and parliament ignore us, we'll get back together again. And that's what makes the Continental Congress so special. It is the first ongoing centralized decision-making body in North American colonies. It's very important because they did, in fact, reconvene. They were ignored. Their first effort was ignored. Fighting began in the colonies. The battles of Lexington and Concord took place shortly after the Congress had disbanded. These are the, just to sort of trigger your memory, these are the battles of that are connected with the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. The British are coming, the British are coming. That's something I'm sure you've heard of already. I'm just reminding you of it. That battle there in Lexington and Concord occurred. And so fighting had begun. And so this Continental Congress came back together as they promised that they would. They joined back together in the summer of 1775. And here are some of the things that they had to do, and they did do. Fighting has begun, so they organized a Continental Army. And this is not like the armies of today. These are your Minutemen. You might have heard of from your high school history classes, the farmers who had guns and were required to step up at a minute's notice to fight for their colony. They formed a militia, and they were not well trained, and they were not well supplied, but they were willing to fight for the cause. And so they were organized by a new military leader, George Washington. He volunteered. He was a successful soldier in the British Army who had helped the British Army win the French and Indian War. He'd made a name for himself as a very successful soldier, and he was willing to lead the Continental Army. And so he took responsibility for that and pulled the militias together and tried to train them and coordinate a military response. The Continental Congress also started coining money. It was called the Continental. It was an actual coin. And that was used for trade, not particularly successfully, but it was there. The Congress appointed diplomats, Ben Franklin, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, were sent abroad, particularly to England, to be diplomats on behalf of the colonies, asking for aid, asking for soldiers, asking for guns, asking for money to help them fight for the colonies, fight for their fight for their independence. They weren't immediately ready to declare independence. They did try one last ditch effort to bring peace peacefully without fighting. It was called the Olive Branch Petition. They were very humble in this petition, referring to themselves as loyal British subjects, appealing to their most sovereign king for an end to these unjust laws. But it was ignored. And King George's response was to send more troops. He hired a mercenary army of Hessians over to North America to fight for the British. So as the war actually escalated in response to the petition that was really just seeking a peaceful resolution. One of the pivotal things that helped turn the tide of support for independence was the publication of Common Sense. There's a tiny little block here in the image that depicts what it kind of looked like on the front cover. It was written by a man named Thomas Paine, and it was unique because of the way it was written. That what he was writing about was well known. He was writing about social contract theory and natural rights and popular sovereignty, all the things that previous leaflets had been referring to, but he presents it in a way that everyone can understand in a very common sense fashion, something even less well-educated people could relate to and understand. And so it garnered support. Oh, and he also was very religious, not personally, but he used religious analogies there to help make his point. And it was very, very persuasive. And even though, only about a third of the colonists actually, that might surprise you, a half to a third of the colonists supported independence, but everybody else they were loyal. So you did not have all colonists in favor of declaring independence. Only a portion of them were in favor of it. But Common Sense helped gain a lot of support for independence. And so that brings us to the very next accomplishment of the Continental Congress was the appointment of a committee to write an official Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson gets all the credit for having written this, but he was working with the committee, just so you know. This slide has a link to the text of the Declaration of Independence, and you have a learning module assignment number 4, in which you are asked to read it in its entirety. It's not very long. So you were to read it and answer some questions based on it. So that's something you want to make sure that you do when you are finished listening to this lecture. I'm going to move on. Trust that you'll do that. And let's talk about a significant portion of the colonial population were enslaved. Unfortunately, your textbook does not provide much discussion of the experience of African Americans at this time. So I wanted to throw this in. And you have another learning module assignment number 5 is asking you to go to a website that was created by PBS, and it does a really good job of describing the experience of African Americans at this time. And so what I'm about to talk to you about came from that website to a large extent. And I'm going to trust you to go and read the narrative information. And I actually have a primary document, a manuscript written by a young man who lived there in the colonies at the time. He was of mixed race descent. His name was Lemuel Haynes. So he was an indentured servant who became free. And he was very intelligent and a prolific writer and pastor. So, and very politically active. So you'll read something he wrote and study this as part of that learning module assignment. But I'll go over a few points right here. Before you think slave labor was only happening in the South, let me assure you that is not true. There were slaves in all 13 colonies, and abolition took root in the northern colonies first. But they even after the abolition of slavery in those colonies, they still benefited from the institution of slavery because the trade between the colonies. They the industries were buying raw materials from the South that were produced on plantations that had slave labor. So it's benefiting the entire British North America. They're enjoying the benefit of slavery. And even though they had abolished it in their own colonies. So it is a colony-wide problem, not just in the South. The South was just the holdout in abolition. Some of the African Americans worked not just on plantations and farms, but off the plantations and farms. Some of them were tradesmen, very skilled tradesmen, and they were able to earn their own money. Sometimes they were able to keep it. Most of the time, they had to give it back to their so-called master. But some were able to buy their own freedom, and on rare occasions, some were born free. So they weren't all enslaved. Some African Americans had some autonomy and freedom, not many. By 1750s, the time period we're talking about, African Americans' attachment was to America. They saw themselves as Americans. They were born in America. The importation of slaves from Africa was continuing, but most of them had lived in America for generations. So America is their home, just as much as it was the home of white settlers in the colonies. And they were a religious group as well. Religions from Africa came with the slaves across the ocean, but they also experienced the Great Awakening, just as the white settlers did. So the Christian fervor that spread with the Great Awakening made its way in and among the enslaved population, and it mixed somewhat with the African religions. But the spread of Christianity into the enslaved population was pretty vast. And religion kind of gave African Americans a sound foundation for arguing for their freedom, so they could use the principles of the gospel about equality and God's love for all humanity and tie that into the other rhetoric that they're hearing. The political philosophies that white people were talking about made their way into the enslaved population and enslaved communities, hearing the same words about people having their own autonomy, people having natural rights, equality of all individuals. They hear that. And so they're asking themselves, well, if that's true, why am I a slave? Why do you hold me in bondage? If I am a man, if I am a woman, and I have these rights and I am equal, it is unjust to hold me as a slave. So now they've got a strong, strong foundation for arguing for abolition. And they were politically active. They used religion, they used Enlightenment principles to argue for the abolition of slavery. To the extent they read the Declaration of Independence, they could even use that very language from the Declaration of Independence to support abolition. And white people at the time were not ignorant of the hypocrisy that was in place with the Declaration of Independence. They, it wasn't lost on them that, on their right hand, they're talking about how all men are created equal, but on the left hand, they're holding people in bondage. So that it's not, they know that this is hypocritical. They're just not doing the right thing, not doing anything about it. There is a communication network among the enslaved population similar to the committees of correspondence. It's just less well organized, obviously, because they were enslaved and had little political power to coordinate their efforts. It did exist. And if someone were to ask, what side are you on? Are you a patriot? To ask, I'm saying, like, if you asked a slave that, they could go either way. Their concern clearly is for their own freedom, and they hear the patriots making the cry for freedom. So that sounds right. And they may want to support the patriot cause because they believe in equality and freedom. Or they could choose to fight with the loyalists, the colonists who were on the side of Great Britain, to join forces with them. And they had reason to, because this is Lord Dunmore. He was a British governor, so a British person on the side of Great Britain. He issued a proclamation inviting slaves to run away from their patriot masters. So he was specific to just patriots, people on the side of American independence. Those plantation owners, those particular slaves were invited to run away and join up with Lord Dunmore and fight for the to fight for the British side of the war. And many of them did. Many did form. He promised them freedom. If they joined up with Lord Dunmore's regiment, they would be granted their freedom if Great Britain won the war. So they had their choice. They could fight for the British. They could fight under George Washington. George Washington initially allowed it, but then stopped allowing slaves to serve in the military. But then desperate times call for desperate measures through his eyes. And so he then allowed the formation of African American units in the Patriot Army. Some slaves, though, this last bullet point, just to make the point that some slaves were forced to fight. They were required to do that in the place of their so-called master, or sons of the masters. So if a rich plantation owner didn't want his young man, his own son, to go and fight, he could send a slave instead. So double unfairness there. So that's a bit about the experience of African Americans. I wish we had more. I hope you will go and look at that PBS website, Africans in America During the Revolutionary War, and learn as much as you can about that, but particularly focusing on that one assignment that is part of this learning module. Oh, I have this slide in here so you could see the discussion of slavery that was in the early draft of the Declaration of Independence. It does mention the institution of slavery and the wrongness of it. But this particular language, you see it highlighted, italicized there. It was deleted. Maybe that doesn't surprise you. It might surprise you that it was there originally, but it was not kept. So when you get to the final draft of the Declaration of Independence, you won't see a discussion of it. So we've declared independence, we're fighting a war, and we need a government. And so the first governing document, the United States of America, our effort to form a government for the 13 colonies, now states, was known as the Articles of Confederation. This is not the U.S. Constitution. We're not there yet. Before the U.S. Constitution, our governing document was called the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union between the states of, and then it lists there the 13 colonies, now states. They called themselves a confederacy, not a nation like we would refer to now. They were called a confederation. And your textbook defines that system of government as a highly decentralized form of government. Sovereign states form a union for purposes such as mutual defense. So if you want a good description of our first national government, it would simply be a group of states. Each state, there were 13, had its own constitution. Each state had its own militia. Each state had its own executive, a governor. Each state had its own legislature. Each state had its own court system. It's like 13 separate nations living in North America close to one another who agree to work together. And that's about it. Unity is very limited. They do call themselves the United States of America, but the emphasis would be on states and not united. They were like 13 nations, essentially, who have their own government system in place. They just get together to take care of one another, essentially, on the world stage. And I've got a little bit of like a first, just like the first three articles of that printed on the slide so that you could kind of get a sense of what they're doing. And I'm going to read a little bit from Article 3. The state said states hereby severally, so that means independently of one another, hereby enter into a firm league of friendship with each other. So they're not one nation, they're just a group of nation states. And they're coming together for their common defense, the security of their liberties, and their mutual and general welfare, binding themselves to assist each other against all force offered to or attacks made upon them or any of them on account of religion, sovereignty, trade, or any other pretense, whatever. So that's just to drive home a point that they are not united the way they later would be. They're just kind of coming together for a limited purpose. And that main purpose at this time, this is 1777, when the Articles of Confederation were first adopted. And that's in the middle of the Revolutionary War. The second year of the war is when this document was adopted and the first national government was formed, was during a war for the purpose of fighting a war. So that's why they're coming together. Here are some key features of the Articles of Confederation. It formed one branch of government, just a legislature. There was no executive, there was no president, there was no Supreme Court, no judicial system. It was just a legislative branch. It took the Continental Congress that we were talking about previously and started calling it a Confederation Congress. So each state could send 2 to 7 delegates to serve in the Confederation Congress. Each state would have one vote, regardless of how many people were, regardless of their own population. I'm sorry about that strange little arrow there. I'm not sure why that happened. The point I'm trying to make is each state is operating as one unit. This isn't a nation of people yet. This is a confederation, a friendship of states. So we're not worried about the population of any particular state. Each state's acting as its own little nation, sending its delegation, and each state gets one vote, no matter how many people are in its state. In order to pass legislation, you need a super majority. 9 out of 13 votes was required to pass any legislation. So it's harder to pass a law under the Articles of Confederation than it is today. You cannot change the Articles of Confederation unless all 13 states agreed. A unanimous vote was required to change anything about it. The legislature that it formed, the Confederation Congress, had very limited power. It could negotiate with foreign powers and Native Americans. Now, that would have been essential because we are in the middle of a war. They could coin money and borrow money on behalf of the Confederation. They could declare war and peace, so they could enter into the treaty to end the Revolutionary War. They could appoint officers of the army, and they did. They appointed George Washington as the general of the Continental Army. They controlled a postal service, which was essential for spreading, mail and trade and commerce, but also communications about the war effort. And there are a few very notable accomplishments of the Confederation government, and this is not in your textbook, so pay particular attention here. The A notable accomplishment of the Confederation government was the passing of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. So this is after the war, the Revolutionary War was over, and the Confederation Congress enacted these laws. It was actually a set of rules to govern the entrance of new states into the United States of America. Having won the Revolutionary War, we now have all this land, and some of it is very sparsely populated, but population is growing. So these sort of rural territories are going to become states. They're going to want to join the Union and become a state. And so the Northwest Ordinance provided the rules for that to occur. And it was a huge success. It was a way to avoid violence and overcome some of the border disputes that might have occurred. And very significantly, one of the rules for the admission of the new states was that slavery could not occur in the Northwest Territory. It was abolished in the Northwest Territory. And that's progress. That's some serious progress that was accomplished by the Confederation government to ban slavery there. They also set aside monies in the Northwest Territory, property in the territory for public education. So here you see the birth of the public education system that came about through the Northwest Ordinance. I have a hyperlink here in the PowerPoint. If you want me to, email me and I'll send you this link. I understand it's not going to work through the video lecture, but if you'd like to, you can learn more about the Northwest Ordinance. You just ask me, I'll send you that link. Anyway, important aspect, good things about the Confederation government. They won the war and then they passed the Northwest Ordinance. Notable accomplishments there. But there were many problems with it. As I mentioned before, it was nearly impossible to change anything in the Articles of Confederation because you needed a unanimous vote. The Confederation government could not tax its citizens. It was entirely dependent upon the states. So if they needed money, it would request money from the states. And the states were supposed to provide that support, but oftentimes they neglected to do so. So that left the Confederation government in debt. They could not pay the militia. They could not provide them with guns or boots or food, coats. They were very, very underfunded. Even during the war, it was a sad state of affairs. They could not pay back the debt. So to the extent they were able to get loans to help pay for the war, they could not pay it back after the war because they didn't have any sort of funding in which to do so. They didn't have any credibility abroad with foreign nations because of their insolvency. Foreign nations were very reluctant to loan any more money. If the original loan wasn't being repaid, why give more? You know, a bank's not going to lend you more if you aren't paying back your debt. So they had trouble getting new funding even after the war. So underfunded, that was a big problem with the Articles of Confederation. Under the Articles of Confederation, states could coin their own money. So yes, there's a continental coin, but then there is currency from South Carolina, currency from Virginia, currency from New York. Each state had their own money. There's no standardization. So without standardization, there isn't a lot of trust in the value of each item of currency. So that's a big problem. The Confederation government could not impose tariffs. So tariffs are like taxes on imports. They're called tariffs, imports and exports. They are an external tax. The nation, the United States, could not impose them, but states did, and they did so inconsistently. So it was kind of like almost like a tariff battle between the states. You know, states could impose tariffs on each other. It was very inconsistent, and there was very little standardization in there was no regulation of trade. The Confederation government could not regulate commerce among the states. So interstate commerce was not effective. It was occurring, but it was inconsistent and far less effective than it would be if there was some sort of standardization. There was no judicial branch, as I mentioned earlier. So any boundary disputes among the states had to be resolved in state courts. So that was a problem. There was no national system of courts to resolve interstate disputes. And there's no army. That, we had states sending their militia to help fight against Great Britain, but after the war was over, those state militiamen went back home, and they were not paid soldiers. They did not work for a national government. They worked for their state governments. They were fighting for their states. And so after the war was over, they go home, and there's no army left to help defend the nation against foreign, so other countries that might still have an interest in the Americas, and they couldn't fight back against domestic insurrection as well. And here's a big example of that. Something called Shays' Rebellion. This occurred shortly after the Revolutionary War ended in Springfield, Massachusetts. Some of the militiamen who had fought in the Revolution returned home to go back to their jobs, to go back to their farms. And when they arrived, they discovered that the banks who had loaned them the money to buy their farm and pay for their home were foreclosing on those debts. While fighting as soldiers in the Revolutionary War, they had been unable to pay their mortgage, to pay their debts. So when they returned home, they've lost their property, and they're infuriated by that. That's terribly unjust to lose your property while you're fighting for your country. So they petitioned for help from the national government, from the state governments, to prevent the foreclosure and loss of their property. But the state and national government, the national government couldn't do a thing about it because there was no National Guard. There was no national judicial system. There was nothing that the Confederation Congress could do to help them. And the state governments are on the side of the banks. So they're unwilling to come and help these farmers. So a group of them get together under the leadership of a man named Daniel Shays. Daniel Shays. He was a captain in the Revolutionary War. And he organizes a group of farmers to arm themselves and march in and sort of siege the courthouse there in Springfield, Massachusetts, to try to stop the foreclosures on the properties and prevent them from losing their homes. And it's violent. It lasts for several months. If you see the dates there, August of 1786 through January of 1787. It was a long and difficult time. And as I said, neither the state nor the national governments were able or willing to do anything about it. And so that is setting the stage. Shays' Rebellion highlights the flaws and problems that existed in the Articles of Confederation. And it taught the national government that they needed to make some changes. They were underfunded, and they were unable to provide safety and promote the well-being of their citizens. The nation was failing, and they had to do something about it. And that's where I'm going to stop. We'll pick up there next week with the next learning module. But so we're ending it. Hopefully this is like your cliffhanger, and it makes you want to see, okay, what are we going to do now? Our government is failing. It's on the verge of disaster. This new grand experiment in self-government and democracy, all the world is watching us, and we can't even keep our own citizens safe. What are we going to do? How are we going to fix this? And that's where I will pick up with the next learning module.